a letter to the church in one of the most influential cities of the ancient world. This powerful text from the Apostle Paul unpacks the mystery of salvation, God's sovereignty, his plan for all people, and his unsearchable mercy. But head knowledge is nothing without transformation. So Paul offers real and practical answers for Roman readers and for us today. How these foundational truths should shape the way we live, in our relationships, in our priorities, and how we view the world around us. This is Paul's letter to the Romans.
Well, good morning and welcome to NorthPoint Church. My name is Jay Quick and I'm on staff here at the church. I had a question for us this morning. Have you ever been around somebody that's been just incredibly generous? Somebody that is just generous with all that they have and have blessed you with the things that they may have. I have a friend of mine, Brent, and his wife have just been incredibly generous to my family and me personally throughout the years of knowing them. And they've blessed us in so many ways with meals, encouragement. Just had a text the other week about how they're praying for us and our family. Just the generosity has been so great from them. And if you want to love me well, you can take me fishing like Brent does. Like I love to go fishing. I love to be on a boat. I love to even catch fish. So if you put me on the fish, it's even better. And Brent has done so much through the years for me and my family. And it's really easy to like those people, isn't it? Have you ever been around somebody that's really generous with what they have and they give to you? It's pretty easy to love them well. I was having a conversation just this last week with an individual, a NorthPoint college student, and we were at Wendy's of all places. And I was like, I haven't been to Wendy's in years. Like, what in the world? He goes, I eat Wendy's like once a week. It's awesome. I was like, oh, the college days. When you're living and you're broke and you're eating like chicken nuggets off the dollar menu and things. And it made me think of a time of the hospitality that was displayed when I was in college. When I was in college, there were some families that lived close to our campus that I was friends with, and we got invited to their home for a hot meal. It was amazing after living on like McDonald's chicken nuggets and whatever else we would find to eat and scramble through the closet. A home-cooked meal was so awesome, but it wasn't just a meal. It was the endless desserts, the chocolate chip cookies, the brownies, the ice cream. They weren't just hospitable with their food and generous with those things. It went to the, hey, anytime you want to use our hot tub in the dead of winter in Minnesota, come use those things. It's like, yes, absolutely. Another one of our friends' parents had a pool. I got to use that all summer long. I had crashed up there for a summer while I was working. They said, hey, just come sleep. We got an extra bed down here. Just the hospitality and the generosity of these people. It's really easy to love those type of people. I think we can all agree with that. How about maybe the other side of that? People who show a lack of hospitality, or people who fail to be generous, or maybe moving a little further on the scale might just flat out be a jerk. Are those people as easy to love? And it's not a trick question. The answer is no. They're not quite as easy to love as those people who are generous and hospitable and have given so much to us. It's a little bit harder to love those type of people. And what we're going to talk about today is this code of conduct, this code of ethics that Jeremy spoke on this past week. We're going to laser in a little bit more of what love looks like in the face of evil. How do we respond as followers of Jesus? What's our obligation and opportunity to press into evil, and how do we respond? And so we're going to look at Romans chapter 12 today. We're going to find a few answers there. So if you have your Bibles, it's on page 920. And as we kind of dive into that, I do want to just say one thing that I'll probably say a little strong, but I need it to be heard. As we press into this passage, I want to acknowledge anybody who has been through any form of abuse. This passage doesn't always and exactly apply to your situation. And first and foremost, I want to say I'm sorry. I'm sorry for what you had to endure, potentially what you're currently enduring, where you're at. NorthPoint wants to be a place of grace and truth for you. And we're sorry for your situation. And secondarily, I want to say to those who have used the Bible in certain situations to manipulate and to continue their abuse, to stop it. That is not what this text is for. That is not what the Bible's for. It is not to thump somebody with, to continue to keep somebody in submission to you so that you can manipulate that situation. Romans 12 verse 9 says, love must be sincere. And then Paul follows up that with this, hate what is evil. That's the first thing he describes after that, hate what is evil. And you have a NorthPoint staff and pastors and elders at the church who hate abuse. We will not stand for it or tolerate it in any way, shape, or form. And as we go about this passage today, you'll see some of the context of why I say that here, but I want to say that strong enough that you have a staff and leaders and community group leaders here at this church that we hate what is evil and we cling to what is good. So as we turn there, we see this code of conduct. We can have these hard conversations. And so if you're walking in here for the first time to NorthPoint, you're like, geez, do they always start out with a right hook like that? No, we seek to cultivate communities of grace and truth. But amidst that grace and truth, we're willing to step into hard topics and hard conversations very gracefully, but clinging to the truth of what God's word says. And so in that, this code of conduct, a little bit earlier in Romans 12, it talks about things like rejoicing with those who rejoice and weeping with those who weep, and there's space for that here. Just here at the church, part of my role is I get to do a lot of the premarital counseling and some of the weddings. We had a beautiful couple just get married 8 days ago here. So excited for their journey. We celebrate their new marriage. We rejoice with them. And then on the other side of the equation, there's space for those whose marriages haven't fully panned out. We've got ministries and we step into that space and we weep with those who weep. And the same stays, this stage right here was full just a few weeks ago with child dedications. And we rejoice with new life. And we rejoice with the baptisms we had, just 9 baptisms a few weeks ago. We rejoice in those things. And on the other side of the equation, we get a care list as staff each week to pray for you. And we see the needs and we see what some of you are going through, the difficulty, the hardship, the loss of loved ones. So on one side of the equation, we're celebrating new life, and then we're also mourning those who have lost loved ones at funerals and stepping into those space to weep with those who weep. And so that's how some of this grace and truth thing plays out. And then Paul says, hey, how do we respond to evil? And he gives us an invitation here. We're going to start in verse 14. And what we're going to see, I'll start there and we'll jump to 17 through the rest of the chapters. There's kind of 4 pretty strong instructions, 4 negative imperatives where he just says, do not. And he jumps right into it. So we're going to take a look at those 4 do nots and this invitation from Paul to live a higher calling. He says in verse 14, bless those who persecute you. Bless and do not curse. His instructions are to avoid cursing. And I just got to say, we're not exactly talking about cursing in those 4-letter words, although some of us could grow maybe in that area. But cursing is more so seeking to cut somebody down. Maybe seeking to gain influence where they're not in the room, to speak ill upon them, to shred them when they're not near. For those of you who have maybe been persecuted for your beliefs in Jesus, of what you believe and what you stand for, it's not to just obliterate them and to shred them and to get back at them. He's saying avoid cursing. And the second one is down at verse 17. He steps into this after that. He says, do not repay anyone evil for evil. Paul's challenge is to avoid repaying evil for evil and to avoid retaliating. We're not to step into that space when evil comes our way, when we encounter evil. The next one down in verse 19 says, do not take revenge. We're supposed to avoid taking revenge. We're called to a higher road in that. And then in verse 21, there's another do not. It says, do not be overcome by evil. We're called to avoid being overcome with evil. And if you could look at these 4 things, you can kind of see them on the left side of the screen in your Bible. You could summarize them that they kind of fit together fairly well. You're kind of like, they say similar things. And as you're looking at them, you may be able to summarize it in a way like this. In the case of retaliation and revenge are not for the believers. As followers of Jesus, we are obligated to not seek to retaliate or revenge, but rather we're called to peace. It's fairly similar progression throughout there, but there's also this progression where it kind of builds a little bit. If you notice at the top of 14, it starts with words, then it kind of moves towards actions, and it gets to being overcome by evil of necessarily who we are. Some ancient philosophers have said a phrase like this. Other people describe it like this, but you may have heard something like this before. Our thoughts lead to our words, and our words lead to our actions, and our actions lead to our habits, and our habits lead to our character. As you think about that, that might be something like what we think leads to things that we say, and things that we say leads to our behaviors, and our behaviors turn into habits. If they aren't positive habits, they're potentially addictions, which lead to the outcome of who we are. Our thoughts lead to our words, and our words lead to our actions, and our actions lead to our habits, and our habits lead to our character. And what Paul's kind of getting at here is be careful about the words that you speak out of your mouth. Because it's not long after you begin to curse those who persecute you that you move down to repaying evil for evil and you retaliate. And after you retaliate, you seek a lifestyle of revenge to just get back with that anger and malice that maybe is building up. And before we know it, we have been overcome by evil. Evil's overcome us because we respond to evil with the same playing field of evil. And Paul's saying, avoid these things. Avoid these things. This actually happened to me just a few short weeks ago. I was having a conversation with some people, and I needed to provide some context of a conversation and some things that were happening, some prior history. And as we were having that conversation, that person had hurt me in the past, had said some things about me in the past, had kind of riled me up a little bit, and I was still carrying that wound a little bit. And in this conversation, as I was trying to provide context, I just kind of threw a few zingers, in there. A couple right hooks, boom, got him. Like, man, oh, that felt good for like 2 seconds, And I was convicted the next day, and God brought that to my attention about my heart and how I was addressing the situation. I sent an apology to those 3 people in the conversation. I just said, hey, I know I was providing context that was probably helpful for some decisions to be made, but my heart was not in the right place. I chose to use my words to really curse. And they're like, well, we didn't see that. We're on your side, Jay. And I began to kind of go, oh my gosh, like, have I gotten really good at just kind of throwing those passive-aggressive right hooks? I need to check my heart on that situation. And I began to think how important it is for us to use our words wisely, because it's our words that lead to our actions, and our actions to our habits, and our habits to our character, and that's just becoming who we are. If you notice at the beginning of the chapter in Romans 12, I think Paul starts out in an important way. He says, therefore, I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy. If you've been here over the past few weeks, Jeremy's hammered this point, but we have to live with mercy in mind. It has to be that way, because if we don't see that we've received mercy, it's so much harder to be able to give mercy. Then he follows it up and he says in Romans 12:2, do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. It starts in our minds. And if we have this place in our minds where we're playing the victim card, as I was really good at playing that victim card in this situation, I'm gonna play the victim card and kind of throw the right hook at these guys and get them on my side. The actions are soon to follow, and I found myself wanting to repay evil for evil and then to seek revenge, and all of a sudden I myself am overcome by evil. And Paul says to avoid these things. We're actually invited to a higher calling. Not just to avoid certain things, but actually to move towards a couple things. So there's 4 counterparts we're going to look at in this text as well. If you notice in verse 14, Paul says this, bless those who persecute you. Bless and do not curse. So it's not just avoiding the cursing part, but it's moving toward those to seek to bless. And I know that we may see curse and think of a 4-letter word, but I think we should see bless and think of a different 4-letter word, and that's to pray. I remember when I was a middle school boy, I was at a lunchroom one time and I was sitting at a table, and all of a sudden after the first few weeks of the school year, I go up to the table and I get ready to sit down and they're like, hey, JJ, there's no more room, sorry, dude. And I'm like, what? There's a seat right there. They're like, sorry, we're saving it for somebody else. And as a middle school boy, that's kind of a big deal. I was like, what? Did I just get booted from the cool kids table? What's going on, And I remember going home that night, and I was in my room and talking with my mom as she was coming to say goodnight, and she's like, hey, buddy, you doing okay? And it's like, how do you know I'm okay? What? Red eyes, tears on my face, and she graciously came around me and said, what's going on? Tell me some more about the situation. As we talked about it, she said, Jay, I think that we should pray for this boy. Why don't we seek to bless him? Why don't we pray for this individual? And we began to pray for this individual by name over the next few weeks and months. And then sure enough, one day after school, I'm opening up my locker and getting ready to head home for the day. And I hear this, hey, JJ. That's what they called me in middle school. Hey, JJ. And I turn around and it's the guy who kicked me out of the lunch table. And I'm like, me? Like what? And he goes, I'm moving into your neighborhood. I can't wait to be best friends. I'll see you soon, man. Thinking, what? Like you want to be best friends with me, the guy that you kicked out of the table? What? This is crazy. And I thought back on that situation. Had I chose to curse the person who had put me in a hard situation and acted in a way that was difficult, I would have lost a gospel opportunity. And over those next few months and years, we did grow to become best friends, and he began to come to our student ministry at the church, and he began to come with a young adult ministry in the area, and he came to the Fellowship of Christian Athletes that was a part of our school, an integral there. And I remember when his life kind of hit the fan in college, he calls me, he goes, "Hey, JJ, I need your help, man. I need you to pray for me. I need your prayer. I'm in a hard spot." When we seek to bless, especially in the form of prayer, it begins to move our hearts and our actions in a certain direction. You know, prayer is a little bit like spiritual primer. I don't know if you've ever painted before, but I just got done painting my entire basement a couple of years ago, and we put gallons of this primer stuff on our drywall. If you've ever painted on drywall that has not been painted, it just eats it up. I mean, just gallons after gallons after gallons. So we primed the whole thing, and then we pulled out the paint, and we started painting the basement. And spiritual prayer is like a spiritual primer. It makes it easier to paint if you've applied the primer first. And just like it's easier to love somebody in your actions if we've prayed for them first. Our actions soon follow our words. It's really hard to hate somebody that you begin to pray for. There's something that happens in our heart that begins to change when we pray and seek to bless our enemies as opposed to curse our enemies. And shortly after that, our actions begin to follow. And we see that take place in the next one, in verse 17. It says this: "Do not repay anyone evil for evil. Be careful to do what is right in the eyes of everyone. If it is possible, as far as it depends upon you, live at peace with everyone." Prayer and blessing primes us not to repay evil for evil. We can avoid that, and we can step into seeking peace. We can respond by seeking peace. I love, there's a verse in Romans chapter 5, verse 8 that said, "God demonstrates his love for us in that while we were sinners, Christ died for us." He did it first. Not like after we were done sinning, but while we were sinning. He didn't just say, "I love you," but he demonstrated it by giving up his life on the cross for us. He demonstrated it. And I think it's important for us to think through as we read this passage here. Verse 18, I want to break that down for just a moment. This passage says, "If it is possible," meaning it's not always possible to create and seek peace. And kind of going back to the beginning, in some scenarios, it's not healthy or wise to seek peace in a scenario where you may be in potential harm of abuse or another scenario. It's not wise at that point in time to seek peace. If it is possible means it's not always possible. But the second part kind of captures it a little bit more. It just says, as far as it depends upon you, seek to create peace with everybody. I live with 4 children in my house, and believe it or not, a church staff member, my kids fight like once a year, not very often, but like 6 times a day or so. But we say this phrase quite often to them. They come to me, "Dad, I got hit." "Well, what did you do?" "Well, I hit him back." "Braden, as far as it depends upon you, seek to create peace with everyone." "Why did you hit?" "Well, they hit me." "Well, Mom, she called me stupid." See, as far as it depends upon you, it doesn't matter what took place prior, as far as it depends upon you. You can control how you respond. You can choose to create peace. There's gonna be punishment for what they did, but now you're both in trouble, right? They're both offenders there. I know this is kind of an elementary age example, but it's true, isn't it? We can seek to create peace with those around us. But what about some of us who are maybe clinging to a little bit deeper pain? Not just being called stupid or dumb, but something a little bit deeper. I couldn't help but think of Corrie ten Boom. If you're familiar with Corrie ten Boom, she was one during World War II who had hid Jewish people inside of her home with her family. And after a while, she was found out, and she herself was sent into a concentration camp in Ravensbrück. And she tells a story in this book. It's called Tramp for the Lord. It's a story of that begins where the hiding place ends. She wrote her first book, The Hiding Place. This is kind of a follow-up to The Hiding Place, a great bunch of life lessons. There's 30-some chapters in here about what she's learned about forgiveness and how to respond to evil and a ton of great things. The Hiding Place really describes what took place, but this is a follow-up to that. And she tells a story as a follow-up in this book that was a repost from Guidepost magazine. But in that story, she says this, that she visited Germany in 1947. And if you're a world historian, you know that's not that far after World War II stopped. So she's returning to the place of which she was in captivity in this concentration camp. And she says, I returned to Germany. You could see this war-torn, bombed-out place and a group of Germans who were completely hopeless. And so she came to seek hope for them and bringing a gospel message of forgiveness. And as soon as she delivered this amazing message of forgiveness, she retells this story that afterwards a gentleman stood up in the back and began to approach her, and immediately she recognized him, for he was among the most cruel guards at the concentration camp where her and her sister were, where her sister eventually died at this concentration camp. And he's heading for a deadline just straight at her. And he doesn't recognize her, but he goes up to Corey and he says, fine message, a message of forgiveness. I needed to hear that. Shortly after World War II, I accepted Jesus as my Savior, and I'm a Christian now. I've been forgiven by God, but I'd still love to be forgiven by you. I was at Ravensbrück, the place that you talked about. She sure recognized him. And in that moment, he sticks out his hand and asks for forgiveness from Corey, and all of a sudden Corey is reminded with memories of her sister who dies in this camp, and all of the torment, physical and emotional, the pain that she had to endure, and all of her other friends. And this hand is lingering. After she just gives a message on forgiveness, the guy that she maybe hates most in the world, who was partially responsible for killing her sister and tons of other women, is asking for forgiveness. And she retells the story. She says it like this. She says, Jesus, help me. I prayed silently. I can lift my hand. I can do that much. You supply the feeling. And so woodenly and mechanically, I thrust my hand into the one stretched out to me. And as I did, an incredible thing took place. The current started in my shoulder and raced down my arm, sprang into our joined hands. And then this healing warmth seemed to flood my whole being, bringing tears to my eyes. I forgive you, brother, I cried with all my heart. I couldn't help but think of Romans 12:18. As far as it depends upon you, Corey says, I can raise my hand. I can't do anything more than that. Jesus, I need your help. You've been around NorthPoint long enough. She's summarizing one of our main values, to look to Jesus. She's looking to Jesus to say, God, there's no way possible I could do this, but I know that you can supply the strength. A little bit later in this book, she tells another story about forgiveness. I love that. I just want to read you just a short part of that. She says towards the end of the book, she says, I wish that I could say after a long and fruitful life traveling the world, I had learned to forgive all my enemies. I wish that I could say that merciful and charitable thoughts just flowed from me and on to others, but they don't. If there's one thing I've learned since I passed my 80th birthday, it's that I can't store up good feelings and behavior, but only draw them fresh from God each day. We can't muster up those feelings and charitable acts ourselves. They must be drawn from God each day. She goes on a little bit later after that paragraph to tell about when she was in her 70s. Years later, after she had forgiven this guard at Ravensbrück, she goes, you would have thought that the scenario that I was in would be easy. Some friends had betrayed her. She was really wounded in her 70s. And she goes, man, you would have thought it would have been child's play to forgive these friends, but it wasn't. Because I seethed for weeks on end. I was so angry, full of bitterness and anger and rage and malice, until I decided to draw fresh from God again daily and looked again. And he was the one who supplied the feeling. As far as it depended upon me, I could press towards him an act of forgiveness for my friends. Tim Keller, in his book, Forgiveness, he talks about this idea that I think summarizes this so well. He says, forgiveness is granted often a good while before it's felt, not felt before it's granted. What Tim is saying here, man, if we're waiting for the feeling to forgive that person who wronged us, who hurt us, who put us in that difficult situation, if we're waiting for the feeling to go, I'm finally ready to forgive, it may never come. Forgiveness is granted often a good while before it's felt. I think that was what happened in Corey's situation. I know I can relate to that as well, and sometimes in my life. This third kind of counterpart is in verse 20, right after it challenges us to avoid taking revenge. We see in verse 20 this, on the contrary, instead of taking revenge, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him something to drink. In doing this, you will heap burning coals on his head. Paul's invitation for us to respond to a higher calling is this: serving. I don't know if you're like me, serving's hard. I have a hard time serving my friends and sometimes family because I'm selfish. And now, Paul, you're saying I need to serve my enemies? This is crazy. This is not something that we can do on our own. This is really hard. And I think the second part of this, of why it's really hard, is we live in a culture that's really good at avoiding things, man. I am so good at avoiding the conflict. I'll run and hide. I'll say, I'm not gonna take revenge. I'm not gonna retaliate, but please don't make me see that person the rest of my life. I don't ever see him, I don't wanna talk to him. I'm just gonna avoid it altogether. But avoidance isn't loving. As we think about Jesus, his experience here on earth, Jesus didn't come to be served, but he came to serve. And when we avoid somebody, we surrender a gospel opportunity to be had, to see what God can do. We have to draw fresh from God each day, just as Corey spoke about. We can't do it on our own. We look to him. But as we begin thinking with our words to choose to bless instead of curse, shortly after, hopefully our actions begin to become a little bit easier, where we seek peace, and maybe with God's strength, we can be able to serve our enemies. There was a number of years ago, I was kind of caught in the middle of some conflict, and I had a mentor friend of mine kind of walking me through some of the conflict and how to approach it, and he was in the conflict too, and I was just like, this is awful. I hate conflict. I just want to die. This is terrible. And his advice to me that day was, he said, you know what, Jay, we're going to outlove and outlast these people. And I thought, oh, that's really good. That's like coffee cup quotable stuff. Like, we're going to outlove and outlast. What the heck does that mean? I don't know. I began to follow it up, and he just said, we're going to kill him with kindness, Jay. Which is a little bit of an oxymoron. Killing isn't always kind, But what he's getting at is we are going to respond with kindness. And kindness looks like seeking to bless instead of curse, and seeking to seek peace instead of retaliating and repaying evil for evil. And it looks like serving amidst wanting to take revenge. And as we do so, gospel opportunities arise. And I could say a decade later, I'm so glad that I chose that higher road, because there were those times you just want to throw those zingers at them, Tell people about, get on my side, these people are jerks. Rah. But I'm so glad I took the higher road, because I think that had I chose to use my words in that way, my actions would have soon followed, and my actions would have become habits, and my habits would have led to my character and who I am. And I can stand clearly before God to say, by your strength and by your grace and by looking to you, to keep close watch over my words. And you know what? A decade later, the conflict doesn't exist. And I'm so glad that we had responded in the way that it did, as much as I wanted to just throw the zinger. But had I been overcome by evil and the rage and the anger and the malice and those things, Tim Keller speaks into that, and he has this to say in his forgiveness book as well. He says, if you maintain your anger, coldness, and ill will towards the wrongdoers, that can make them feel more justified. They themselves tell themselves what a cruel person you are and how you deserved it for whatever they did. If we don't defeat evil through forgiveness, evil wins. Evil wins in the world, evil wins in the perpetrator, and evil wins in you. As we seek to respond, to not be overcome by evil. In verse 21, he says, avoid being overcome by evil. Overcome evil by doing good. He's essentially just saying we are to respond by loving our enemies, loving them by kindness, seeking to bless, seeking to create peace, and seeking to serve, and looking to Jesus for his strength in doing so. There's an example of this. We're going to hear a testimony video in just a moment of an individual who went through this. He doesn't have enough time to share all of the story there, but this individual was wounded quite deeply to the core. His house was broken into. His house was, personal items were stolen from this individual. This individual disrupted his entire nuclear family and caused a ton of pain. But he responded with love. I'm excited for you to hear his story now. You go ahead and check that video out.
Hi, my name is Dave Scrooby, and I'm just here to tell a story about forgiveness. We moved to Northern California when I was in the 3rd grade. As time went on, my mom started making us go to church on Sundays, and my dad never wanted to go. And he would watch football and drink beer, and see you when you get back. But I love my dad, and I know he loved me. And many times we get back, we play catch in the yard or whatever. But as time went on, me and my brother started to know something was up. When I was about 13, we had chores in the house. And one of the chores that I had one day was to do the laundry. And I went to the hamper of the laundry, and I'm pulling everything out at the dryer or at the washer. And I reach down into the bottom, and I pull up this box. And I opened the box, and in the box was a needle and a spoon, and it was a drug kit. A couple of years later, I was 15, I was a sophomore in high school. I hear my mom answer the phone, and I hear her just crying hysterically. And I come out of my room, and I'm like, Mom, what's wrong? What's wrong? She goes, it's your dad. He's been arrested. And it turned out that he had, with another guy, went to the neighboring town, and they'd cut a hole in the roof of this pharmacy and dropped in, and they had found the opiates, and he had rigged up inside there and passed out, and the other guy left, and he was busted. And it was just part of how my dad and I just started hating him. He got out of jail. My mom and dad tried to work it out, but the next year they got divorced, and he kept getting busted. He just would get busted, and I just felt like he kept choosing drugs over me and over my mom especially, and over my brothers. I'd been going to church every Sunday with my wife, and Sunday came up, and the pastor was like, today we're going to talk about forgiveness. And I said, And he says, well, here's what I want to do, what I want you to do. After he kind of spoke a little bit, I want you to close your eyes. I want you to think about somebody that you need to ask for forgiveness or give forgiveness to. It's kind of interesting because that day, there that walked in the door in front of me, there was this guy, his name was Gary. And Gary and I had a kind of ugly spat over a real estate deal. And right away I thought, it's Gary, he's sitting right over there. I catch him in the parking lot, and I'm like, Gary, I feel like that was about us. He goes, I feel the same way. We hugged each other, and I thought, oh, praise God. And I went home, and I just felt the presence of the Lord. And he said, wrong guy. I went, wrong guy, Lord, the guy was right there. You set it up. And I just felt the prompting to close my eyes again. And whose face did I see? It was my dad's. I'm like, I'm going to see him. We went. I'd also brought a Bible for him. And when I came in through the doors and they check you in, they frisk you and you walk through the thing, the main guard said, what's this? I'm like, oh, it's a Bible. I was hoping to give it to my dad. He goes, well, read the rules. You can't give any hardcover Bibles. Guys are making, shanks and stuff out of that. He threw it up on the shelf and he said, you can get it when you leave. I'm waiting at the glass, and I see out of the corner of my eye, this guy come in, kind of stooped over, and he's pulling an oxygen tank. I look over and I double take, and it's my dad. And he gets up to the window and he sees me, and he's like, why are you here? What happened to your mom? At first he thought there must have had something happen to my mom, that's why I would come to see him. I told him, I said, I came to see you because I came to ask for your forgiveness. And he said, why? I should be asking for your forgiveness. I said, I hated you. I wanted to forgive you. And we both cried. And I asked him, what's wrong? And he's like, well, they think I've probably got hepatitis A, B, and C, maybe even AIDS. And I got probably not long, but I'm glad you came. So I left. Now, when we were going out the door, I went up to the little guard station there, and I said, I left a Bible, and they wouldn't let me give it to him. And I still had tears, on my face. And she took the Bible down, and she thumbed through it. She looked at it, and she looked at me, and she said, I'll make sure he gets it. Well, about 3 weeks later, I got a letter. This letter was, I read the Bible you gave me, and I went to the chapel, and I asked Jesus into my heart. About 3 months after that, I sent me a letter saying, I got a year left on my sentence. They have said that if I could find my way into a program, halfway house, something like that, they'll cut me loose. I was working with these guys that did just that. And a couple, 3 weeks later, my dad came. The next week in church was me and my wife and my kids, my 2 girls, and my mom and my brothers. And for the first time in my life, my dad singing the songs. All of us crying in the row. Came to church about 2 or 3 weeks in a row, and he came to Easter Sunday, and there we were, all hands raised in the service, and we had this big dinner, and we got some photos. And on Tuesday, I went and I knocked on his door, his little apartment door, and nobody answered. But I could hear inside the door wheezing. And I was thinking, oh, he's off his oxygen or something. And I went in, and he was in a coma. And I called 911, and they came, and he passed 3 days later. But he knew the Lord, and there'll be another day, and I will see him again. It's just an amazing thing. You know, I thought that I was doing something that was going to relieve my burden. God did something way better.
Absolutely love it, yeah. I heard that story on the phone with Dave a few months back, and I got together in person and heard it, and we're both crying, and I've watched the video about 10 times myself leading up to this, and part of the story that wasn't told in that is that at Easter Sunday, his dad wanted to be baptized. And you can't exactly dunk somebody on Super Bowl Sunday at church, right? Like it's the big deal Easter, you can't just do that. So he said, how about next week? And Dave's dad passed that week. You get a chance to baptize him. But out of an act of courage and forgiveness, reconciliation took place because as far as it depended upon Dave, he sought to create peace with everyone. And as I think about Dave's story, I don't know what type of evil you've encountered in your life in the past or are currently experiencing, or maybe potentially even in the short-term near future, but God does. He's there with you, and he wants to move in your heart and through your heart if you're willing to invite him in. And so this morning, as we reflect on Romans 12, I just want to give you the invitation to say, God, what do you want me to do with what I've heard today? Is there somebody I need to text? Do I need to pick up the phone and make a call? Do I need to hop on a plane and go see somebody? God, what is it? Whatever you're willing to do in my heart, I'm willing to say, yes, Lord. And would you put that as the posture of your heart? And you might not have the feeling to do so, but God can help supply that as it comes. I couldn't help but think and wrap up with this verse in 1 Peter 2, verse 23. It says this, when they hurled insults at him, meaning Jesus, he did not retaliate. When he suffered, he made no threats. Instead, he entrusted himself to him who judges justly. And I don't know where you're at in your scenario or your relationship, but maybe you're clinging on to this sense of justice and you just can't quite let it go. But when I see this verse of the example, the one who went before us as they were bringing him to the cross to crucify him, they hurled insults, he did not retaliate. He suffered, he made no threats. Instead, he entrusted himself to him who judges justly. The gospel promises us justice. And we have a just judge who is seated on the throne who will deal with that. And we're reminded by the gospel that we're not the ones to judge. We have a just judge seated on the throne, and we can trust him for his gospel promise. So NorthPoint, let's look to Jesus. Would you pray with me? God, we thank you for your grace and your goodness. We thank you for a passage of a code of conduct in Romans 12 that just challenges us. God, help us to see gospel opportunities amidst our pain, amidst our difficulty, and in the face of evil. God, teach us and show us how to love and how to respond to bless those who persecute us and to seek peace instead of repaying evil for evil. And Father, teach us how to serve when we're tempted to take revenge. Help us overcome evil by loving our enemies. Jesus, we need your help. We draw fresh from that each day. We love you, Father. I pray this in your name. Amen.